Most guests at this podcast change the world for the better. Today's guest just changed the world. Whether that's the same thing, well, that's exactly what we're here to discuss. Karl Marx, philosopher, economist, revolutionary. The man whose ideas inspired more flags, more regimes, and more mass graves than perhaps any other thinker in history.
You begin with provocation. How very bourgeois of you.
Fair enough. Let's start differently then. Tell me what you saw. Because you were not writing in a vacuum. The world around you was genuinely brutal.
It was. England in the 1840s. Children working 14 hours a day in mines and textile mills. Men broken by labor before they were 40. Families living in conditions I would not describe at a table where coffee is being served. And the men who owned the factories, growing richer by the season. That was not coincidence. That was a system. And systems can be understood, analyzed, and changed.
And that's what you set out to do. Starting with the Communist Manifesto in 1848, which you co-wrote with Engels, and then Das Kapital, which took you the rest of your life.
The manifesto was a call to action. Das Kapital was the science behind it. 18 years of research, every assumption tested, every number examined. I did not write pamphlets. I built an analysis.
And what did that analysis tell you?
That capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. The worker produces the value with his hands, his time, his life. But the owner of the factory captures that value and pays the worker only enough to survive and return tomorrow. That difference, what I called surplus value in Das Kapital, is the engine of profit and of exploitation. It is the logic of the system itself.
And the solution?
Collective ownership of the means of production. No more factories owned by one man and worked by thousands. The workers own what they build. The state, which has always been an instrument of the ruling class, as I argued in the manifesto, withers away once class itself disappears. And what remains is a society organized around a simple principle, which I laid out in the critique of the Gotha program. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs.
That is a genuinely beautiful idea.
It is a logical one. Beauty is incidental.
Then let's stay with the logic, because that sentence, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, who decides what each person's ability is? Who decides what each person needs?
The collective.
The collective is not a person. It cannot decide anything. Someone decides for the collective. And that someone will have a name, an office, and eventually a secret police. Every time.
That is a distortion.
It is a logical conclusion. But let's stay practical for a moment, because I want to understand how this actually works on the ground. In your system, financial incentive is gone. No one earns more for working harder. No one earns less for working less. So tell me, why would anyone volunteer for the worst jobs? Who does the work that nobody wants to do, and why would they do it well?
In a truly communist society, as I described in the German ideology, labor becomes an expression of human creativity, rather than a burden imposed by necessity. Man works because it fulfills him.
That is a lovely theory for artists and philosophers. What about the man unclogging the drain at 3 a.m? Is he fulfilled? Is the coal miner fulfilled? The garbage collector? You are describing human nature as you wish it were, not as it is. People work harder when there is a reason to work harder. Remove the reason and you remove the effort. And then, when effort disappears and production falls, what does the system do?
The transition period requires discipline.
It requires force. That is the word you are avoiding. When people do not cooperate voluntarily, and they will not, because voluntary cooperation at that scale has never existed in human history, the system has only one tool left: compulsion. The Gulag was not an accident of bad leadership. It was the answer to your question about who cleans the sewers. You make them, at gunpoint if necessary.
I never advocated for that.
You built a system that cannot function without it. And that brings me to the deeper problem, the foundation itself. You called this science, but your entire system rests on a specific assumption about human nature, that once you remove private property, once you eliminate class, people will stop competing for power, that the state will wither away, that leaders will surrender control once the revolution is complete. Where does that assumption come from?
It comes from the analysis of conditions. Human behavior is shaped by material reality. Change the reality.
You borrowed it from Rousseau. Man is naturally good. Society corrupts him. Strip away the corrupting structure, and human nature will cooperate, share, relinquish power voluntarily. That is not science, Karl. That is faith. And you dressed it in footnotes and called it Das Kapital.
The materialist conception of history, which I developed in the German ideology and elaborated throughout my work, is not reducible to...
Every civilization in human history has had people who seized power and refused to let go. Pharaohs, emperors, warlords, tribal chiefs, long before capitalism existed. You're telling me that's all the fault of private property? That it has nothing to do with what humans actually are?
The structures shape the behavior. Reform the structure.
And you get Stalin. Who came from your structure? Who abolished private property? Who collectivized the farms? Who did exactly what the manifesto prescribed, and then shot anyone who disagreed? Not because he misread you, but because power, once seized, is not returned. That is not a distortion of human nature. That is human nature.
Lenin and Stalin betrayed the principles.
They followed the logic. Your theory requires that at some point the people holding power voluntarily give it up for the greater good. Name me one moment in human history where that happened willingly. Just one.
You are conflating theory with implementation.
I am reading your own words. In the manifesto you wrote, "The ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions." Chapter 1. You did not invent the violence accidentally. You built it into the foundation, and the people who came after you found it there and used it enthusiastically.
That refers to the violence of the existing order.
It refers to yours too. In 1849, in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, your own newspaper, you wrote, "We have no compassion, and we ask no compassion from you. When our turn comes, we shall not make excuses for the terror." That is not Stalin. That is you. The ends justify the means. It is there in your own words, decades before a single revolution. And that single idea, that this suffering now will end all suffering later, is responsible for more deliberate human cruelty in the 20th century than almost any other thought in history. Because it does not just permit horror, it blesses it.
You are describing the abuse of a framework, not the framework itself.
I am describing what happens when you build a system on a false premise. If your foundation assumes the best of human nature, and human nature does not cooperate, you do not get utopia. You get a machine that has to force compliance. And a machine that forces compliance at scale is called a totalitarian state. Stalin, 20 million dead. Mao, 45 million in the Great Leap Forward alone. Cambodia, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela. Every single time, Karl. Every time someone built what you described, the The state did not wither away, it metastasized.
Capitalism has also produced suffering. Colonialism, child labor, financial crises that strip millions of their savings while bankers collect bonuses. Or do those not count?
They count. And here is the difference. Capitalism has a mechanism for self-correction. Markets, competition, democratic pressure, reform. It has been challenged, regulated and improved precisely because it allows dissent. What is the self-correction mechanism in a communist state? Who do the workers complain to when the state is the employer, the judge and the only landlord in the country?
The transition period requires patience.
The transition period has killed 100 million people, Karl. At what point does the transition become the destination?
You oversimplify because you lack the intellectual framework to...
That is what your advocates always do, isn't it? Anyone who disagreed lacks the framework. Anyone who points at the bodies is oversimplifying. Anyone who lived through the consequences just don't understand the theory well enough. It is a perfect system, not because it works, but because it can never be proven wrong. Every failure is someone else's fault. The theory is always innocent.
History will vindicate the analysis. What you call failure, I call incomplete execution.
Incomplete execution. There's a phrase.
I think this interview is over.
We are almost finished. The man who wrote about exploitation was supported his entire life by Engels. His wife managed the household. His children went without shoes. He fathered a child with his housekeeper and let Engels take the blame for years to protect his reputation. The author of Das Kapital, a 1400-page treatise on the exploitation of labour, could not run his own household without exploiting the people closest to him. Does that not mean anything to you?
My work has nothing to do with my personal life.
It is the most personal thing there is. You did not just write economics, you wrote morality, and morality begins at home. Last question. If you could go back, knowing everything done in your name, would you write it differently?
I would write it more clearly, so that small men could not twist it.
Not differently, just more clearly.
The diagnosis was correct. The patients were incompetent.
They were not the patients, Karl. They were the butchers. And 100 million people paid with their lives for that so-called incompetence.
History is not made without cost.
Karl Marx, a man who had an answer for everything, except the one question that mattered most. If man is not naturally good, what happens to the theory? If you want to go deeper, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto are where it starts. Read them, understand the argument, and question it. This has been Coffee with Giant Fails.
Fails. Historically premature.
See you tomorrow.